Welcome to a new series called Reading Carl Jung. Today's video examines an essay entitled The Stages of Life, found in Volume 8 in the Collected Works. In this essay, Carl Jung provides us with a four-stage developmental model of the psyche that attempts to cover the entire lifespan. Near the end of the essay, we're provided a handy metaphor of the sun rising and setting as a means for envisioning these four stages. Psychic life, like the sun, rises in the first half of life, whereby consciousness and ego emerge and make their impact on the world. Then, in the second half, we have the waning of energies as psychic life begins its gradual descent back into the depths of darkness. Jung describes stages 1 and 4 as similarly entailing a kind of submerging into unconscious happenings and a time in which we're more of a problem for others than we are for ourselves. Now, of course, this submerging is going in opposite directions as it decreases over stage 1 and gradually increases in stage 4. But what does Jung mean when he says that we are a problem for others? He doesn't mean this negatively, but rather as a marker of our dependency needs as infants and as elderly. This idea reminded me of the book Dependent Rational Animals by the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, where he argues that social dependence is a constitutive element of human existence that, rather than being an exception to ordinary life, or rather than fleeing from this reality, that it should be the very basis for an understanding of what it means to flourish as a human and as a human community. So with that framework in place, let's address more specifically what's going on in the first stage. In Jung's analysis, we're provided an answer to the question, how does consciousness emerge? As infants, we begin, he claims, as an unconscious mind, which he equates with nature and the instincts. It's a kind of paradise, a Garden of Eden, whereby we're blissfully unaware of problems. Jung states that the psyche proper has not yet been born, but will only gradually emerge with the appearance of consciousness, which is a gradual development leading up to puberty. Consciousness is first observed to emerge beginning with the child's demonstrated ability to recognize and know who others are. So knowledge begins to awaken consciousness, a knowledge that, like the forbidden fruit, also leads to the loss of paradise as the submergence with unconscious life begins to be sacrificed for the sake of acquiring consciousness. At first, this consciousness is sporadic and chaotic, a collection of disconnected islands, some of which contain the initial seeds of an ego, but one not yet quite identified with. As we begin to transition from the first to the second developmental stage, those elements of consciousness begin to consolidate. The ego starts to acquire a kind of independent psychic energy that ultimately gives rise to a feeling of I-ness or subjectivity, what he also calls the ego complex. Some other changes also mark this period. First, whereas an infant I was a problem for others, I now encounter conscious problems, problems which may derive from external hindrances, but also may represent the beginnings of inner psychic difficulties. However, some of these difficulties lead to a disturbance of psychic equilibrium, resulting in neurosis. Herein, it's the unconscious that becomes the problem for us. The conscious mind attempts to render such problems as simple and certain as possible, avoiding and resisting the complexities and obscurities that often plague problems of life by either rejecting what is strange and foreign to us or seeking to subject it to our will and control. In moving from stage 2 to stage 3, we shift from adolescence and the young adult years to the midlife years. We've passed the high noon of the sun and begun the gradual descent. Consequently, we also reach a crossroads whereby we face the path of either clinging to the illusion of a childhood consciousness or facing the disillusioning end of our dreams. We can see both responses in those going through a midlife crisis. On the one hand, you have the stereotyped example of the middle-aged man having an affair and purchasing a Mustang convertible. On the other, there's a notable increase in depression as we are made to confront the end of specific dreams, often dreams based upon a childhood consciousness that contained exaggerated expectations and underestimation of difficulties and unjustified optimism. Having recently entered this stage myself, I can attest to this experience. In college, I would have described myself as an unjustified or naive optimist, both about others, myself, and the world. And I often look back at my college years with a kind of longing nostalgia, especially in light of the constant busyness and endless demands that everyday life now brings. There's a sense of a loss of the excitement of the newness of all of life that came with college to now the mundane, repetitive nature that is the existence of a middle-aged individual. Nonetheless, this present period of life is also an opportunity to begin recognizing and accepting those parts of my life deemed different and strange, to widen the horizons of my life by embracing what Jung calls here the also me. As I've gotten older and hopefully a little wiser, I've started to care a whole lot less about stuff that doesn't really matter. If I got negative feedback in my 20s, I felt like it was the end of the world. Now, when it comes, and it certainly comes more often now than ever before, I don't feel like it calls into question my entire being. I listen to it to see what I can glean and move on, not putting further thought toward it. This change in me actually freed me to start creating content on YouTube and at the same time allowed me to discover parts of myself that actually enjoy this process of making videos. So something that seemed very foreign to who I was for most of my life is now part of the also me. Finally, there's the fourth stage, marking the twilight of our lives. Jung doesn't say much about this stage here, but one interesting point he addresses that's relevant to reflections on the end of life is a need he identifies for believing in some kind of continuation of life after death. Jung doesn't consider such a need to be the misplaced feeling originating from a bygone age that's irrelevant to our present day. Instead, he suggests it's there for a reason, that it has a purpose that we perhaps are not entirely aware of. He gives the example of how the thyroid is a gland that was believed at one point to be useless, but is now recognized for the essential functions it plays. Similarly, Jung argues the primordial images emerging from the unconscious, giving rise to religious symbols that speak to possibilities after this life, may have some unknown purpose, and it would be short-sighted to consider it senseless simply because we can't presently identify its practical function. And so this completes our consideration of the stages of life. The following video will examine the essay entitled Instinct and the Unconscious. If you found this video helpful, please support this work by liking this video and sharing it with others. And until next time, be well.